Inside the grand halls of the Kremlin Palace, Vladimir Putin sat alone in his high-ceilinged office, staring blankly out the large window. The wintry Moscow skyline stretched endlessly beyond the frosted glass, but the beauty of it no longer stirred anything within him. His fingers rested against a closed Bible on his desk, a book he had once clung to as a moral compass, but which now raised more questions than it answered. His heart, once resolute, was now burdened by a weight he couldn't explain. For decades, Putin had been known to the world as a strongman, a strategic thinker, and a devout Orthodox Christian. His public appearances during Easter, his visits to Orthodox cathedrals, and his declarations about Christianity being the soul of Russian identity had long cemented his image. But in the quiet of his study, away from the cameras and political stage, he began to wrestle with doubts he had buried for years. At first, it was subtle, small contradictions he noticed between the sermons delivered by priests and the scriptures he read himself. The deeper he studied the Bible, the more confused he became. Why did the church speak in metaphors that didn't match the verses? Why did it exalt traditions that seemed to have no foundation in the actual words of Jesus? Over time, what had once been faith began to feel like a carefully managed illusion. The unease grew stronger during private meetings with religious leaders. Putin, ever the analyst, noticed how evasively they responded when he asked direct questions about divine justice or theological clarity. He asked them, "Why does the Church speak of mercy but endorse political violence? Why do priests live in luxury while preaching humility?" Their answers were vague, poetic, and, to his dismay, intellectually hollow. These were not the responses of men grounded in truth, he thought. They were the rehearsed defenses of a tradition too afraid to evolve. Late at night, he returned to his reading. But now he didn't just open the Bible. He began exploring other religious texts. The Quran, the Torah, Eastern philosophies. He wasn't looking for religion, he was looking for answers. Truth that didn't rely on mysticism or contradiction. Truth that didn't hide behind hierarchies or rituals. Truth that could guide a man not just in worship, but in governance. Among all the books he touched, one began to grip him in a way he hadn't anticipated: the Quran. He read it slowly at first, skeptical. But as the words sank in, he found something he had not felt in a long time: clarity. The repeated emphasis on monotheism, justice, charity, humility, and honesty resonated with him. There was no worship of men. No complex theology to decode. Just the absolute oneness of God and a lifestyle based on truth and morality. Putin found himself turning to Islamic scholars, not publicly, of course, but in private meetings under tight security. He invited respected Muslim clerics, both from within Russia and abroad, to visit him under the pretense of cultural exchange. But in those sessions, he was not the president. He was a seeker. He listened. He asked questions. And for the first time, he received answers that didn't rely on ambiguity. They quoted scripture, offered logical reasoning, and spoke humbly, not as political advisors, but as believers. One conversation haunted him for days. A cleric from Chechnya told him, "Power means nothing if your heart is restless. Peace doesn't come from the world respecting you. It comes from you respecting the one who created you." That night, Putin couldn't sleep. His heart raced. The words echoed again and again. The one who created you. What if all this time, his power, his influence, his nationalistic pride, what if it was all a distraction from the real purpose of his existence? In the following days, he began fasting in secret. Not as an act of conversion, but as a personal experiment. He wanted to know what it felt like to resist worldly comforts. To focus inward. And in those days of discipline, he discovered a calm that years of luxury and control had never given him. Still, the stakes were enormous. He wasn't just any citizen. He was the president of Russia. A country with deep Orthodox Christian roots. A nation where faith and state often walked hand in hand. Any hint of deviation could trigger political collapse, internal rebellion, or worse. If he was to continue this path, it had to be in silence. For now. But the silence began to break him. During one winter afternoon, he stood in the great hall of the Kremlin where a massive statue of Jesus Christ stood. The statue had become a symbol of state faith, a merging of politics and religion. And yet, as he looked upon it, he felt no connection. Instead, he felt judgment. Not from the statue, but from the conflict within him. Was this image a reflection of his faith, or a monument to a religion he no longer believed in? He remembered how Islam forbade images of prophets, how it emphasized sincerity over symbolism. He couldn't ignore the hypocrisy anymore. In his mind, this statue no longer represented spiritual comfort, it represented political performance. And it had to go. In that moment, he made a silent vow. If the path he was walking truly was the truth, he would not stop at personal faith. He would align everything around him with it. He would cleanse the symbols of falsehood, not to attack another religion, but to realign the nation with a deeper, more universal truth. But first, he needed confirmation. A sign. Not a miracle. Not a voice from the sky. But something internal, complete spiritual certainty. He intensified his studies. He met more scholars. He read tafsir, Quranic interpretations, hadiths, Prophet Muhammad's sayings, and the biography of the Prophet peace be upon him. The more he read, the more he wept. Islam was not just a religion. It was a complete way of life, with guidance for the ruler, the worker, the parent, and the child. Eventually, in a quiet room in his private residence, with only a single imam present, Vladimir Putin closed his eyes, raised his finger, and recited the Shahida. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The words shook the air. His heart trembled, but not with fear. With relief. For the first time in decades he felt aligned. Whole. At peace. But outside that room, the world was about to change. And Putin knew, this was only the beginning. Vladimir Putin stood in front of the mirror that night, staring at his reflection longer than usual. Something in his eyes had changed. The same cold, calculating stare that once commanded generals and terrified rivals was now softened by a strange calmness, almost like a man reborn. Yet outside that room, nothing had changed. The Kremlin still pulsed with strategy, secrets, and state affairs. The Russian people still knew him as their president. No one suspected the storm that was quietly brewing inside the heart of their leader. Putin had uttered the Shahida in private. He had committed himself to Islam with full conviction. But the weight of his decision was heavier than any military campaign he had ever launched. Russia was not prepared. The world was not prepared. He had to proceed with caution. In the days that followed, Putin resumed his presidential duties, attended cabinet meetings, gave press statements, and reviewed defense plans, just like always. But privately, his life had begun to change in subtle yet powerful ways. He prayed 5 times a day in secrecy, performed ablution with quiet discipline, and spent hours memorizing verses from the Quran with the help of a trusted imam. His closest aides began to notice the shift. He was more patient, less irritable. He declined alcohol at official dinners. He stopped attending Orthodox services altogether. When asked why, he offered vague answers. I'm exploring new spiritual paths. Or, I need time for personal reflection. But they could feel it. Something fundamental had changed. Meanwhile, Putin's thirst for deeper understanding of Islam only grew stronger. He invited Islamic scholars from across the Muslim world, Turkey, Chechnya, Uzbekistan, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. They arrived in secret, flown in under diplomatic cover, and taken to private chambers deep inside the Kremlin. There, Putin would sit with them for hours, taking notes, asking questions, challenging ideas, and listening more than he spoke. He wasn't looking for political alliances. He was seeking spiritual truth. "What is justice in Islam?" he once asked a scholar from Damascus. The scholar replied calmly, "Justice in Islam is not to favor your friend over the truth, nor to hate your enemy so much that you deny them their rights. It is to stand on the side of truth, no matter what it costs." That sentence lingered in Putin's mind for days. In his world, loyalty had always come before justice. But in Islam, justice stood alone, untouched by bias or political convenience. It terrified him. And it thrilled him. As weeks turned into months, he began to internalize the teachings. His relationship with power started to shift. Islam emphasized humility, accountability, charity, and compassion, virtues that were rarely found in the corridors of Russian politics. He began quietly reforming policies behind the scenes. He ordered anonymous donations to orphanages, pushed for legislation that protected workers' rights, and had food delivered to poor families in the countryside. But that wasn't enough. His transformation demanded something larger. Something symbolic. Something the entire world would witness. There was one monument inside the Kremlin that had long symbolized Russia's religious identity, a towering statue of Jesus Christ, surrounded by saints, placed prominently in the Hall of Faith, a room often used for state ceremonies and Orthodox rituals. Every president before him had stood beneath it, reaffirming Russia's allegiance to Christian orthodoxy. Putin began to resent that statue, not because it represented Christianity, but because it now felt like a lie. A performance. A relic of a belief system that had failed to offer him the clarity and peace he had found in Islam. To him, that statue was no longer a symbol of faith, it was a symbol of confusion, contradiction, and political control dressed as religion. One late evening, he visited the Hall of Faith alone. The room was empty. Cold. Silent. He stood before the statue, staring into the stony eyes of the figure carved in marble. "You were never the problem," he whispered. "The problem was the empire built around you." He didn't speak again. But in his mind, he made a decision: the statue would have to go. Not out of hatred, but out of sincerity. He didn't want any religion weaponized for political control. Not Christianity. Not Islam. The people deserved honesty. And symbols, he believed, had power. To change the nation, he had to start with its symbols. But it would have to be timed perfectly. While this internal struggle continued, international whispers began to circulate. Western intelligence agencies had noticed changes in Putin's behavior. His silence on church events. His newfound diplomatic warmth with Islamic nations. His refusal to drink alcohol in public. These details, minor on their own, added up to something troubling to the West. "Has Putin converted?" one NATO official asked behind closed doors. "We don't have confirmation," another answered. "But something's happening. And it's big." Back in Russia, word had already begun to leak into political circles. Some Orthodox leaders had noticed the president's absence from major religious events. Certain military generals began questioning why Putin no longer invoked Christian blessings before missions. There was confusion, tension, fear. Sensing the storm on the horizon, Putin decided to take the next step. He began inviting Orthodox priests and bishops to personal meetings. The goal wasn't to confess or reveal anything yet, but to observe their reactions. He wanted to ask the same questions that had troubled him for years, and see if they had answers now. Most of them failed the test. When asked about the contradiction between the Bible's peaceful message and the Church's history of war, the priests evaded. When challenged on the corruption scandals in religious institutions, they deflected. When questioned about the deification of Jesus in contrast with the teachings of earlier scriptures, they became defensive. Putin sat silently in these meetings, his face expressionless. But inside, he felt increasingly validated. These men had no answers, only rehearsed rituals and political performances. They weren't spiritual leaders. They were gatekeepers of tradition. He began drafting a plan. First, he would build a new institution inside Russia, one rooted in Islamic ethics, not Orthodox traditions. It wouldn't be a mosque, but a research center, focused on studying theology, law, ethics, and comparative religion. A place for dialogue, not dogma. Second, he would prepare the people for a shift. Not through force, but through inspiration. He would start publicly quoting universal values from Islam, without calling it Islam. He would speak of justice, mercy, equality, and truth in his speeches. He would quietly introduce Islamic charity initiatives under neutral names. Third, he would prepare the world for shock. He called his closest advisors into a private meeting. Most of them didn't know what to expect. When they arrived, he looked each of them in the eye and said, "Gentlemen, the future of Russia is not in looking backward. It is in embracing truth. Even when that truth makes the world uncomfortable." He paused, then added, "Prepare yourselves. Everything is about to change." The room fell silent. Some were confused. Some looked terrified. But Putin didn't explain further. He simply stood, walked to the window, and looked out over Moscow's skyline again. The snow fell gently on the rooftops. The cross atop the cathedral in the distance glistened in the cold light. Soon, he thought, that cross would be replaced by something far more universal. The crescent. The Kremlin grew quieter in the days that followed Putin's private declaration. Not physically, guards still patrolled the marble halls, advisors still bustled through doors with papers, and the usual machinery of a state continued humming. But there was an intangible tension in the air. A strange calm before a storm. And only a few knew the reason why. Vladimir Putin had begun moving the pieces on a much larger board. Behind closed doors, the president began holding late-night meetings with trusted aides who had previously served him without question. Generals, economists, intelligence officers, men who had known him for decades. But in these new meetings, their president was not discussing military maneuvers or economic sanctions. He was discussing faith. At first, many were skeptical. Some thought he was undergoing a spiritual phase. Others feared it was part of some larger political play, perhaps a strategy to court Muslim-majority regions or allies in Central Asia. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became, this was not a performance. It was conviction. "I've been living a lie," he said in one gathering, his voice unusually soft. "Not deliberately. I truly believed in our traditions. But I've seen something clearer. Stronger. Simpler." He paused and then continued. "Islam offers a structure. A clarity that doesn't bend for power or politics. It holds rulers accountable. That's what we need now, not more rituals, but justice rooted in truth." Some in the room nodded respectfully, not yet understanding the gravity of what he meant. Others looked down, exchanging cautious glances. They understood one thing for certain: Russia was changing, and fast. News started leaking out to the broader political elite. Rumors spread quickly in elite Orthodox circles that Putin had embraced Islam. No official statements had been made, but changes in his behavior spoke volumes. His public speeches began subtly referencing values that mirrored Quranic principles: truthfulness, fairness in trade, protection of the weak, accountability in leadership. He began attending fewer church-related ceremonies and instead showed interest in interfaith meetings involving Muslim scholars. In one televised address to students, he quoted, "Power is a trust, and every leader will be questioned about how he used it." The quote sent ripples across the nation. It wasn't a Russian proverb. It wasn't even Christian scripture. It was from a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. That was the first open crack in the wall. For the Russian Orthodox Church, it was a moment of alarm. For Putin's nationalist supporters, it was a moment of confusion. And for a quiet, growing number of Russian Muslims, it was a signal. A moment of unimaginable hope. Russia has long been home to millions of Muslims, Tatar, Chechen, Dagestani, Bashkir, and others. Historically, they lived on the margins of political life, their presence acknowledged but rarely embraced. Now, for the first time in history, they sensed the ground shifting in their favor. Within weeks, several prominent Muslim clerics were invited to the Kremlin. Photos of Putin seated with imams and Islamic scholars began surfacing online, though the official captions described them as cultural consultations. But those who looked closely could see it: the Quran placed carefully on the table, the respectful expressions, the absence of the usual orthodox icons in the background. This was no longer speculation. The Western media picked up the story, and headlines began flashing. Putin quietly embracing Islam? Kremlin remains silent. Kremlin meetings with Islamic scholars raise questions about Russia's future. Faith or strategy? Putin's alleged religious shift alarms global leaders. Meanwhile, inside Russia, two parallel realities emerged. One was of subtle resistance. Orthodox leaders began issuing statements reinforcing Christian heritage. Some nationalist politicians warned of losing Russian identity. Talk shows debated whether Russia could remain culturally Christian if its leader wasn't. The other reality was quieter, but more powerful. Young Muslims in cities like Kazan, Grozny, and Ufa began organizing educational seminars. Mosques, once sparsely attended on weekdays, began to fill. Copies of the Quran began selling out in Moscow bookstores. Online forums buzzed with cautious optimism. But Putin remained silent on the core issue. He knew that if he revealed his new faith too soon, it could destabilize the entire nation. His silence was strategic, but it wasn't cowardice. He was preparing the nation for a deeper change, one that couldn't be forced by declarations or laws. It had to start in the hearts of people. And yet the pressure mounted. Internationally, Western leaders began to shift their tone. NATO reports began including religious analysis in their briefings. Intelligence officers from the UK and US began focusing on the Kremlin's new alliances with Islamic countries. Trade meetings were suddenly being scheduled with states like Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, and Algeria. Some analysts called it a religious pivot. Others called it a geopolitical earthquake. Inside the Kremlin, Putin was asked about it in a private press briefing. "Mr. President, are the rumors about your conversion to Islam true?" He smiled calmly and said, "I believe in truth. Wherever I find it, I will stand with it. That is all I will say for now." The room fell silent. No denial. No confirmation. Just truth. But behind the scenes, the wheels continued to turn. In a bold yet quiet move, Putin authorized the establishment of a new Islamic cultural and academic center in Moscow, near the seat of government. It would include a research institute, a public mosque, and educational facilities. Though the official statement described it as a cultural bridge, everyone knew what it truly represented: the beginning of a new ideological foundation for the Russian state. But the most shocking moment came weeks later. It was early morning when government employees arrived for their usual duties at the Kremlin. But something was different. The Hall of Faith, the same room housing the grand statue of Jesus, was sealed off by black velvet curtains and armed guards. Whispers spread quickly. Inside, away from cameras, construction crews quietly dismantled the statue. Piece by piece. No cameras. No announcements. Just silence and precision. By nightfall, the statue was gone. In its place, Putin had ordered a simple inscription carved into the wall. "There is no power except from God, and to Him we shall return." It wasn't signed. It wasn't labeled. But those who read it understood: the change had begun. Soon after, select high-ranking officials were summoned for a confidential meeting. The room was small. No reporters. No press releases. Putin stood before them and said, "My friends, I am still your president. I still love Russia. I still love our history. But history evolves. We cannot be slaves to tradition if it blinds us to the truth. I have found peace, and I want you to find it too. We will not force change, but we will welcome it. Russia must be a nation of justice. And justice begins with acknowledging the truth, even if it makes us uncomfortable." No one spoke. Some lowered their heads in reflection. Others stared, uncertain whether to fear or admire the man before them. That night, across Muslim households in Russia, tears were shed, not of sadness, but of vindication. A leader, perhaps the most powerful in the world, had recognized their faith not as a minority belief, but as a guiding light for the future. The silence of centuries was being broken. And the sound that replaced it was not the clash of swords or political slogans, but the whispered words of a verse recited in millions of hearts. "Indeed, in the remembrance of God do hearts find rest." The night after the statue of Jesus was removed from the Kremlin's Hall of Faith, a quiet tension spread through Moscow like an invisible fog. The news hadn't reached the media yet, but among Kremlin insiders, the message was unmistakable. A chapter of history had closed, and something unprecedented had begun. Within 24 hours, internal reports confirmed what many feared, or hoped. Word was spreading fast. Senior Orthodox Church figures were alarmed. Conservative governors began whispering among themselves. Some even called emergency sessions of local councils, hoping to craft statements reaffirming loyalty to traditional Russian values. But the silence from the top was louder than their protests. Putin didn't explain. He didn't justify. He didn't debate. He simply moved forward. That morning, he walked calmly into his office, as usual. He greeted his staff with a peaceful smile. And then, without any fanfare, he signed an executive order authorizing the construction of the Grand Unity Mosque of Russia, to be built just 3 kilometers from the Kremlin. It would be the largest mosque in Europe, complete with public libraries, a school for Islamic sciences, and a center for interfaith dialogue. When his advisors raised their eyebrows, Putin responded calmly. "Russia is home to over 25 million Muslims. It's time we stop treating them as outsiders." The construction plans were submitted, permits were granted, and within weeks, cranes rose over Moscow's skyline, surrounded not by protests, but by curiosity. Camera crews tried to get close. Journalists speculated wildly. But no official press conference came. The president remained publicly silent, but privately decisive. At Friday prayers across Kazan, Grozny, and Ufa, the imams wept. For centuries, Muslims in Russia had prayed under suspicion, under pressure. Now their president had not only joined their faith, but elevated it to a place of national pride. But it wasn't just symbols that were changing. Putin began to overhaul key sectors of governance through quiet reform. He ordered the introduction of Islamic finance principles into Russian banking, starting with interest-free loan programs for small businesses. He pushed for mandatory ethics training for civil servants, based on universal religious values, honesty, humility, compassion, and justice. Schools across the country were instructed to develop new curricula that included comparative religion, not to convert anyone, but to expose the next generation to Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and beyond, with honesty and respect. One policy advisor asked him whether that would confuse students. "No," Putin replied. "Truth never confuses. Only fear does." As these changes unfolded, the Orthodox Church grew increasingly nervous. In an unprecedented move, they demanded a private audience with Putin. He agreed, and the meeting was held in the Kremlin Cathedral, surrounded by candlelight and centuries of history. The Patriarch stood before him. His voice trembled with restrained fury. "Mr. President, what is happening to Russia?" Putin looked at him with serene calm. "She is waking up. You are breaking with tradition. With our faith. With our foundation. I'm not breaking, Putin replied. I'm returning to something deeper. Something that doesn't serve politics, but God. The patriarch leaned in, trying to salvage control. You risk dividing the country. No, Putin whispered. I am uniting it, under truth. The conversation ended there. No agreements. No threats. Just a parting silence that echoed across centuries. The following day, Putin addressed the nation in a rare televised speech. He stood at a podium alone, without military flags or golden icons behind him. Just a plain background and the Russian flag. My fellow Russians, he began. For decades, we have lived under shadows of fear, tradition, and silence. We were told what to believe, how to pray, who to trust. But I believe Russia deserves more than shadows. It deserves light. And I have found that light in a path that is clear, strong, and just. He paused. I have embraced Islam, not for power, not for politics, but for truth. It has given me the peace I never found in the rituals of my past. I will not force this faith on anyone. Russia will remain free. But I will lead with the values I now believe in: justice, compassion, unity, and submission to God alone. The broadcast lasted just 10 minutes. But in those 10 minutes, the world changed. Moscow's streets fell silent. Orthodox leaders clutched their rosaries. Western leaders picked up their phones in panic. But in towns and villages across Russia, millions of Muslims fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. They never imagined they would see the day when the most powerful man in the country, perhaps the world, would say those words. And for the first time, they felt seen. The international response was swift. Western media spun narratives of instability, of radicalization. NATO held emergency briefings. Foreign diplomats sought urgent clarification. But among the Muslim world, there was celebration. From Turkey to Egypt, Indonesia to Nigeria, statements of support poured in. In Mecca, the Imam of the Grand Mosque issued a short but powerful comment. Allah guides whom He wills. And we welcome our brother with open arms. Putin, however, remained undistracted by praise or criticism. He continued with his vision, reshaping Russia one policy at a time. He passed laws protecting the religious rights of Muslims and Jews. He authorized scholarships for Russian students to study in Islamic universities around the world. He opened the Kremlin's first-ever Arabic language department. He even instructed that Friday be recognized as an optional rest day in regions with Muslim majorities. It shocked the nation. But it empowered communities that had long felt like second-class citizens. Of course, not all were pleased. Small protests erupted in St. Petersburg and Novosibirsk. Conservative groups burned Islamic symbols and accused Putin of betraying Russian heritage. Online forums raged with conspiracy theories. But Putin did not respond with force. He responded with restraint. I will not fight hate with hate, he told his cabinet. Let their fear die out on its own. Truth does not need violence. It only needs time. And time was on his side. As months passed, the Russian economy didn't collapse. In fact, it grew stronger. New trade alliances formed with Gulf nations. Investment poured in from Turkey, Malaysia, and Qatar. Russian companies began adopting ethical models of business, based on Islamic principles. And the people began to change too. Headscarves became common in urban centers. Halal food counters appeared in mainstream stores. Quranic calligraphy quietly replaced imperial statues in some buildings. A quiet spiritual revolution was underway, not by force, not by policy, but by example. But the most striking change came when Putin made a final announcement. With measured words, he revealed that he would be undertaking his first pilgrimage to Mecca, not as a head of state, but as a Muslim. A servant of God. The world stopped. Some called it a stunt. Others feared for his safety. But Putin didn't care. "This journey," he said, "is not for cameras. It's for my soul." He departed quietly. No military guards. No grand ceremony. Just white Ihram robes, a few close aides, and a silent prayer. And as he entered the Grand Mosque in Mecca, he wept. Not as a president. Not as a Russian. But as a man who had finally found what the world could never give him: peace. The Kaaba stood before him, ancient and unmoved, surrounded by thousands of other believers. And in that moment, Vladimir Putin was no longer the leader of a superpower. He was a pilgrim, just like everyone else. The image of Vladimir Putin standing before the Kaaba in Mecca was unlike anything the world had seen. He wore the simple white garments of Ihram, like every other pilgrim. No bodyguards flanked him. No ceremonial entourage. Just a man, his head bowed, his lips trembling with silent prayers, eyes moist with emotion. The desert sun shone above him, but he felt no heat. Only peace. Around him, thousands of Muslims circled the Kaaba, whispering prayers, reciting verses, tears streaming down their faces. And yet, no one interrupted him. No one asked for a photo. No one treated him as a politician. In the sacred grounds of Masjid al-Haram, all were equal before God. Putin performed the tawaf like everyone else, walking 7 times around the Kaaba with silent awe. He drank from the Zamzam well, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the cool water to his lips. He sat in quiet reflection near the black stone, not asking for attention, just trying to absorb the gravity of where he was. For Putin, this journey was not about symbolism. It was about surrender. He had built empires, commanded armies, ruled nations. But here, in the holiest place in Islam, he was simply Abdullah, a servant of God. And it was in that humility that he found the dignity he had been searching for all his life. After completing the rites of Umrah, he sat on the marble floor of the Grand Mosque, watching pilgrims come and go. He thought of his past, the decisions he had made, the lives he had impacted, the power he had wielded. And for the first time, he didn't feel guilt. He felt release. That night, as he rested in his modest room in Mecca, he wrote in a small leather-bound journal, "Power gave me the world. But Islam gave me myself." Back in Russia, news of the pilgrimage exploded across every major media outlet. State TV aired no official commentary at first, just silent footage of Putin walking between the crowds, dressed like everyone else. But it didn't need words. The image itself was enough. For Russia's Muslim population, it was a day of pride. Elders who had lived through Soviet oppression wept openly. Young people who had grown up feeling invisible suddenly felt they had a future. Entire villages gathered to watch the broadcast together, many unable to believe what they were seeing. For the Orthodox Church, it was a moment of reckoning. Their most powerful patron had now placed his trust in another path. Some bishops called for public demonstrations. Others chose silence, waiting to see where the tide would turn. In the West, leaders were stunned. The intelligence community scrambled to assess the geopolitical implications. Analysts debated on every major network. Was this a spiritual rebirth, or a global repositioning? Was Russia now an Islamic power? But the truth was simpler than their theories. Putin hadn't converted for leverage. He had converted for conviction. When he returned to Russia, there were no grand announcements, no red carpet receptions. He arrived at a small airport just outside Moscow, stepped off the plane, and bowed his head toward the earth, whispering Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to God. But even though he wanted silence, the world demanded clarity. So, for the first time since his return, he sat for an exclusive interview, one that would be broadcast to every corner of the globe. He looked directly into the camera and began. "I did not go to Mecca as a president. I went as a man seeking peace. And I found it. Not in titles, not in alliances, but in Islam." He continued, "Many will ask, What does this mean for Russia? Let me tell you, it means honesty. It means justice. It means the end of spiritual confusion. Russia is still Russia. We are still strong. But now we are also truthful. And truth does not fear change, it embraces it. The interviewer, visibly moved, asked what had inspired the shift. Putin smiled. The Quran, he said simply. I read it not to argue, but to understand. And it understood me before I could even understand myself. He paused, then added, I have never felt so free. In the days that followed, Putin began implementing policies that aligned with his new values. But he did so carefully, not to impose, but to inspire. He launched a nationwide education initiative called The Path to Light, an optional, values-based curriculum for schools centered on ethics, honesty, compassion, and service. Though grounded in Islamic principles, it was presented in a universal way, accessible to students of all faiths. Participation was voluntary, but sign-ups soared. He also introduced Day of Reflection, a new public holiday during which citizens were encouraged to step back from work, digital distractions, and politics to focus on family, community service, and spiritual growth. Mosques, churches, synagogues, and even secular community centers were encouraged to open their doors for dialogue and shared meals. More remarkably, Putin invited religious leaders of all backgrounds to a summit in Moscow. Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, and Islamic scholars sat at one table. He spoke at the opening session. We may pray differently, but we all seek peace, guidance, and meaning. Let's not fight over words when our hearts share the same longing. Some doubted his sincerity. Some walked out. But most stayed. The summit ended with a historic joint declaration. We reject extremism. We reject division. We seek truth with humility, and we honor the right of every human to seek it freely. Internationally, Putin began to rebuild Russia's image, not through military dominance, but through cultural diplomacy. He visited Turkey, Pakistan, and Indonesia not as a general, but as a brother in faith. He toured mosques, schools, and community centers, offering aid and pledging cooperation. In a speech in Jakarta, he said, Russia is not retreating from the world. We are reintroducing ourselves, with honesty and purpose. In Saudi Arabia, he met with scholars and spiritual leaders, not oil barons or defense contractors. When asked why, he replied, My heart has changed. So must my priorities. At home, more changes continued. Mosques received state funding for expansion and education. State employees were given prayer accommodations during work hours. Islamic banks were licensed and launched across major cities. Yet Putin was careful not to alienate Russia's non-Muslim citizens. He often repeated, Islam teaches me to respect others, not erase them. We rise together, or we do not rise at all. Still, opposition remained. A group of ultra-nationalist politicians attempted to pass a bill declaring Orthodox Christianity the official state religion again. It failed. When asked about it, Putin responded, Faith is not built by force. It's built by truth. Let the people decide where their hearts belong. That evening, the call to prayer echoed across Moscow for the first time from the newly finished Grand Unity Mosque. The voice was beautiful, the words powerful. Come to prayer. Come to success. Putin listened from his office window, the same place where months ago he had stared into uncertainty. Now there was no doubt. There was no fear. Only serenity. And as he whispered the evening prayer under his breath, he knew something he had never truly known before. He was no longer ruling Russia. He was serving it. For all the admiration Vladimir Putin had earned from the Muslim world, and for all the quiet inspiration he had sparked among millions within Russia, not everyone welcomed the change. Beneath the surface of calm and progress, storm clouds were gathering. The Orthodox Church, once the spiritual pillar of Russian identity, now found itself cornered. For decades, it had enjoyed favor, funding, and prestige from the Kremlin. Now, it stood in the shadow of the Grand Unity Mosque, watching its influence wane. Church pews were still filled, but the atmosphere had shifted, less celebratory, more uncertain. In the corridors of power, some high-ranking officials grumbled in whispers. They questioned whether Putin's transformation was weakening Russia's global image. Others, emboldened by ultranationalist voices, claimed he had abandoned the soul of the nation. A few even conspired to push back through political channels. It began subtly. A bill was proposed to restrict the construction of new religious institutions within 5 kilometers of historic churches. Another aimed to limit Arabic-language media on national television. Though cloaked in neutrality, the intent was clear: to slow down the Islamic shift without directly opposing the president. But Putin was prepared. He called an emergency closed-door session with the State Duma and stood before the nation's lawmakers without a teleprompter. "I understand your concerns," he began. "But ask yourselves, have we become weaker since we embraced truth? Has our economy collapsed? Have our people suffered? Or have we gained peace, clarity, and purpose?" He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "Change is uncomfortable. But it is necessary. And I will not let fear dictate our future." The bills were quietly withdrawn. But the ideological battle had only begun. Outside of Parliament, conservative groups began organizing under new banners. They called for protests in the name of preserving Russian heritage. Flyers and online posts circulated with slogans like, "Orthodoxy is Russia," and "Stop the Islamization." A large protest was planned in St. Petersburg. Tens of thousands were expected to attend. The organizers claimed it would be peaceful, but intelligence briefings warned otherwise. Some planned to burn Qurans publicly. Others called for vandalizing mosques. It was a spark waiting for fire. Putin had a choice: ban the protest and risk looking like a dictator, or allow it and risk chaos. He chose a third option. 1 week before the protest, he appeared on live television. Not from his office. Not behind a podium. But seated in a mosque beside a rabbi and an Orthodox priest. He spoke softly, but firmly. "Russia does not belong to one religion. Russia belongs to truth. And truth does not need violence to defend it." He turned to the camera. "Burning a book does not weaken its message. Attacking a mosque does not erase the prayers inside it. Hating a people does not make your soul cleaner. It stains it." The protests still happened. But the turnout was half of what was expected. No Qurans were burned. And at the edges of the rally, young Muslims stood silently holding signs that read, "We forgive you. We are your brothers. We will not hate you back." That day, something shifted. Not just politically, but morally. Many who had attended the protest out of anger returned home quiet and reflective. Some even messaged local imams with questions. A few weeks later, several Orthodox Russians converted to Islam privately, not because of pressure, but because of the dignity they saw in its response. This was the revolution Putin had envisioned, not of weapons or politics, but of character. Meanwhile, the world watched in awe and confusion. Western nations struggled to redefine their diplomatic stance toward Russia. Sanctions once placed for geopolitical reasons were now under review. Trade partners in Europe hesitated, unsure whether to view Russia as a threat, a rival, or a cultural ally in a new global axis. But the Muslim world had no such confusion. Leaders from Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Qatar began referring to Russia as a spiritual partner. International conferences once dominated by Western thought now had Moscow at the table, not just discussing oil or military policy, but faith, culture, and ethics. In Istanbul, during a major summit on global unity, President Erdogan introduced Putin not as a former rival, but as our brother in faith. The room erupted in applause. Back in Russia, the effects of Putin's transformation were being felt everywhere. In rural towns, mosques began offering free Quran classes, not just to Muslims, but to curious non-Muslims too. Islamic charities flourished, distributing food, paying off medical debts, and helping widows and orphans. Corruption cases in government offices dropped significantly, and civil servants reported a noticeable change in workplace culture: more discipline, more honesty, more humility. One young man in Dagestan posted a viral video. He stood outside a government building and said, "I used to think my prayers didn't matter. But now I see the president making sujud. I know God hears us now." Even entertainment and media were changing. Major film studios began producing content that reflected ethical themes. Television dramas started portraying Muslim families with nuance and respect. On one channel, a primetime series followed the story of a former gangster who discovers Islam and opens a youth center in Grozny. Ratings soared. And yet, Putin never claimed to be perfect. In one interview he said, "I have made mistakes. Many. But Islam teaches me that repentance is real. That what matters is not who you were, but who you strive to become." He began hosting monthly town halls, inviting citizens from all walks of life: farmers, teachers, students, religious leaders. These weren't scripted events. He took difficult questions and answered honestly. During one, a young Orthodox woman asked, "Do you regret leaving your faith?" Putin paused, then responded, "I didn't leave it. I outgrew what it had become. I sought God, and I found Him in Islam. But I will never mock what brought me to that search. My journey began in a church. It led me to a mosque. I thank God for both." His humility struck a chord. Even those who disagreed with him began to respect his sincerity. His critics no longer saw a calculating politician. They saw a man transformed. A man willing to lay down power for the sake of principle. And in that transformation, Russia changed too. Marriage rates increased, particularly among young Muslims. Drug addiction dropped in several regions. Mental health hotlines reported fewer calls linked to depression and loneliness. For the first time in years, the Russian people began to feel spiritually whole. But there was still one final step Putin knew he must take. One symbol still stood. One institution remained untouched. The official national religion had never been amended in the Russian constitution. And Putin knew that if he wanted to finish what he started, he would need to rewrite history, carefully, respectfully, and truthfully. He called his legal team. He summoned constitutional scholars. He brought imams, priests, and rabbis to one table. And with measured words he announced, "Let the Constitution reflect not a religion, but a reality. Russia is a nation of many faiths. But our foundation must be justice, not heritage. God above all. Not tradition. Not pride. Not fear." And so, the constitutional amendment began. Not to declare Islam as the official religion, but to declare that no state religion would exist, and that every citizen had the right to seek, practice, and live by the truth they found, without persecution. The amendment passed. The protests were minimal. And as the ink dried on that historic document, Putin looked up at the Russian flag, fluttering above the Duma. He whispered, "Now we are truly free." As the sun rose over Moscow one winter morning, its golden light painted the white domes of mosques and the peaks of old Orthodox cathedrals alike. For the first time in centuries, the call to prayer and the ringing of church bells shared the air in harmony, not competing, not clashing, but coexisting. The capital city, once defined by fear and political manipulation, had become the unexpected symbol of something far greater: transformation through truth. Inside the Kremlin, President Vladimir Putin sat alone in a modest prayer room that had once been an office reserved for foreign dignitaries. The walls were now lined with simple shelves of Quranic commentaries, books on law, and interfaith studies. A Persian rug covered the floor. No portraits. No flags. Just silence, and the gentle ticking of a clock. He stood up for prayer. As he recited the final taslim, his heart felt weightless, like all the burdens of his past were being washed away. He was no longer Vladimir the statesman. Not even Putin the president. He was now just a believer, grateful, humbled, and fully surrendered to God. His journey had not been easy. From disbelief to confusion, from confrontation to peace, and now from peace to purpose. But it had all been worth it. Russia had changed. And the world had noticed. Not long after the constitutional amendment was passed, countries from the Islamic world began to formally request new partnerships with Russia, not just in trade or security, but in religious diplomacy. Conferences were held in Cairo, Riyadh, and Jakarta, all featuring Russian scholars, ministers, and thinkers. The once isolated nation had become a spiritual bridge between East and West. Even the Vatican reached out. In a stunning joint announcement, the Russian president and the Pope agreed to launch a Path of Common Light initiative, fostering dialogue between Islam and Christianity, not to blur lines, but to build bridges of understanding. But perhaps the most unexpected impact came from inside Europe itself. In France, Germany, the Netherlands, and the UK, thousands of young people, watching Putin's journey unfold through media, began researching Islam for themselves. Mosques reported an increase in attendance. Islamic book sales skyrocketed. Online search trends showed one phrase repeatedly climbing in global rankings. What did Putin find in Islam? For many, the answer became personal. In just under 2 years, over 500,000 Europeans embraced Islam, many citing Putin's sincerity, dignity, and peace as the catalyst for their exploration. A man once seen as cold and calculated had become a vessel for light in the most unexpected way. In Russia, social change surged ahead. Prison reform became a major focus. Putin ordered the implementation of rehabilitation through faith, a system inspired by Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, mercy towards sinners and criminals. Rather than punishment, prisoners were offered education, spiritual counseling, and support upon release. Crime rates began to fall. Repeat offenses declined. In the arts, a renaissance emerged. Muslim poets, painters, calligraphers, and filmmakers found their voice in public life. National museums began hosting exhibitions on Islamic civilization. A new music movement called Ruhani, meaning spiritual, emerged, blending traditional Russian sounds with Quranic themes, echoing across subways, concert halls, and even presidential events. But the most powerful shift was in how people treated one another. Charity organizations, once limited to state programs, now boomed with grassroots support. Neighbors took care of one another. Elderly citizens received anonymous food packages. Hospitals reported a rise in volunteer caregivers. The Russia of yesterday, hard, suspicious, politically cold, was melting into a nation of warmth, honesty, and collective humility. Putin remained at the center of it all. But he no longer ruled with force. He ruled with example. He made it a point to live simply. He moved from the presidential estate to a smaller residence. He refused luxury cars and chose instead to walk to Friday prayers in a nearby mosque. He declined lavish banquets and asked that all excess government food be redirected to shelters. International journalists who once feared him now requested interviews to ask about his faith. One British reporter, visibly emotional, asked during a segment, "You were feared by the world. Now you're followed by millions seeking spiritual clarity. Are you still the same man?" Putin answered softly, "I am the same body, but not the same soul." One morning, during a community event, a young boy approached him holding a small wooden box. Inside it was a hand-drawn picture of a mosque with the Russian flag waving behind it. The boy looked up and said, "I drew this because now I feel safe being Muslim." Putin knelt down, took the box, and held the boy's hand. "You are the future of Russia," he said. "And this future will be built on truth, not fear." That evening, the Kremlin's national address aired an unexpected announcement. Putin, now 74 years old, stood in front of the camera wearing no medals or regalia. Just a plain suit and a Quran in his hand. "My beloved Russia," he began. "My journey is nearing its end. Not in sorrow, but in joy. I have seen my country awaken. I have seen truth replace fear. And now I entrust you, my people, to carry the light forward." He paused, then said, "I will not run for re-election. I will return to the life of a servant. I will teach. I will learn. I will pray. And I will watch as the seeds we planted grow into trees of peace." The nation fell silent. Then erupted. Thousands flooded the streets, not in protest but in prayer. Mosques held all-night vigils. Churches opened their doors to interfaith worship. People hugged in the streets, many crying, some singing. Others sat quietly under the stars, reflecting on what it meant to live in a country that had truly changed. A week later, Putin handed over power to a democratically elected successor, a young statesman named Asad Kiryev, born to a Muslim Tatar father and a Russian Orthodox mother. Fluent in Arabic, respectful of all faiths, and deeply grounded in law and justice, Kiryev was the embodiment of the new Russia. On his first day as president, he stood at the Kremlin steps and said, "I will not try to be Vladimir Putin, but I will try to honor his legacy, the legacy of truth." Putin, now simply known as Brother Vladimir, returned to teaching at a small Islamic university in Kazan. He lived in a modest home, wrote reflections on spirituality, and spent his days mentoring young leaders. He refused statues. He declined awards. His only request: "If you remember me, remember only that I searched for truth. And when I found it, I bowed." The final scene of this chapter came not in a speech, not in a mosque, but on a quiet winter morning. Brother Vladimir, walking slowly through a park in Kazan, paused to watch children playing in the snow. Their laughter echoed. Their joy was pure. A group of teenagers, seeing him, ran up excitedly. "Can you teach us a surah, Brother Vladimir?" He smiled, sat on a bench, and began to recite. "By the time, surely mankind is in loss. Except those who believe, do righteous deeds, and advise one another to truth and patience." Surah Al-Asr. As the children listened, snowflakes fell gently across the land. And Russia, once again, entered a new dawn. A dawn of peace. A dawn of faith. A dawn of truth. The morning sun filtered softly through the tall stained glass windows of the church of San Marco, casting colorful light that danced across the ancient stone walls. A gentle breeze stirred the red velvet banners hanging high above the pews. The church, usually quiet at this hour, was now alive with murmurs and movement. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of a growing crowd, all gathered for one reason: the weekly sermon of Sister Olivia. Clad in a crisp black robe, her silver crucifix glinting on her chest, Sister Olivia walked to the pulpit with an air of command. Her eyes sparkled with a passionate fire, and her steps echoed confidence. Many admired her, especially the younger women, for her bold sermons and unshakable belief in her faith. But there was something deeper, hidden even from herself, a fire fueled not by love, but by resentment. She took a deep breath and looked at the congregation, then began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "My brothers and sisters," she declared, "we live in a world that is being shaken by a belief disguised as religion. A belief that brings not peace, but chains." People leaned forward in interest. They called their God by another name, yet deny his love through Jesus. They claim to honor women, yet force them to hide their bodies in shame. They claim to follow truth, yet deny the cross, the very symbol of salvation. A few nodded with solemn agreement. The room grew heavier as Olivia's voice grew louder, her emotions intensifying. They reject the blood that saved us. They say our Savior didn't die, didn't rise, and they call it faith? No, it's deception. She paused, scanning the room. The air had changed. Some in the audience began to fidget, uncertain whether her words were too sharp. But none dared to interrupt her. Then she reached into her pocket and unfolded several papers, news clippings, quotes, internet stories she had saved for this very moment. With dramatic force, she read them aloud. They ban music. They forbid love. They silence laughter and say a woman's smile is temptation. Is this a religion, or a prison built from fear? A deep, uncomfortable silence fell. Even the echo of her last sentence lingered in the stone walls like smoke after a fire. But outside the church, in a nearby garden just beyond the chapel's side entrance, an old man in a white robe had been walking slowly. His pace stopped as he heard the sermon's voice piercing the peaceful air. He stood still, prayer beads wrapped loosely in his wrinkled fingers, his white turban slightly tilted by the breeze. His face was calm, but his eyes dimmed with sorrow. He recognized the accusations too well. He had heard them for decades, but not like this, not inside a house built for worship. His name was Imam Yusuf Rahman, a soft-spoken scholar and cleric, known in the surrounding villages not for loud speeches, but for the depth of his compassion and wisdom. He looked up toward the tall wooden doors of the church. He had never stepped inside. Not because he feared it, but because he respected it. But now, he felt something shift within him. He could not allow such unchallenged words to stand. Not because he sought a fight, but because he feared what lies could do when left unanswered. With steady steps, he approached the entrance. The heavy doors groaned as he pushed them open. The congregation turned sharply. Murmurs filled the room. Sister Olivia paused, her confident posture stiffening. An elderly man in a white robe stepped through the doorway, his gait slow but unwavering. He walked down the center aisle with quiet dignity, his eyes lowered, his expression solemn. No one recognized him, but his presence was undeniable. He seemed out of place, but not unwelcome. Something about his demeanor silenced even the boldest thoughts. Olivia frowned. "Excuse me, sir," she said sharply. "This is not a place for uninvited guests." Imam Yusuf Rahman did not respond immediately. He stopped midway between the pews, then raised his head slowly. His voice was calm, not confrontational. "I came not to interrupt, but to ask a favor," he said gently. "I have heard many accusations just now, about my faith, my people, and what we hold sacred. May I be allowed to respond, not with anger, but with clarity?" The church was silent. All eyes turned to the senior priest sitting beside the altar. He looked hesitant, uncertain how to respond. But Olivia stepped forward again, her voice crisp. "This church stands on the truth of Christ," she said firmly. "Not the teachings of other religions. But go ahead, speak if you must. Just don't expect us to be convinced." Imam Yusuf Rahman nodded politely. "Truth doesn't need force. It only needs to be heard." He walked up to the front, but didn't stand at the pulpit. Instead, he stood just beside it, close enough to be seen, but far enough to show respect. Olivia crossed her arms. "Then let me begin," she said. "You're a Muslim, aren't you? Why does your religion deny the divinity of Jesus?" Imam Yusuf Rahman answered calmly. "Because we believe that worship belongs to God alone. We honor Jesus deeply, as a prophet, a messenger, and a servant of God. But we do not worship him, just as we do not worship any human being. But salvation," Olivia challenged, "comes from his sacrifice on the cross. By denying it, aren't you denying salvation itself?" He shook his head slowly. "We believe salvation comes from sincere faith and righteous deeds. Forgiveness is from God, not bought through blood. If God is truly merciful, does he require a death to forgive? The room went still again. Some began to listen more closely, surprised by his tone, so soft, yet so steady. Olivia narrowed her eyes. Then what about history? Islam spread by the sword. Everyone knows that. Imam Yusuf replied. Islam spread through trade, dialogue, and invitation. Yes, wars happened, but they were in defense, not in conquest. If Islam truly spread by force, there would be no Christians in Egypt, or Jews in Morocco. But they still exist. Why? Someone in the pews nodded faintly. Olivia tried again. What about women? Why do you force them to cover up? Why do Muslim women have fewer rights? Imam Yusuf looked directly at her, but not harshly. Covering is not about shame. It's about dignity. Just as you wear this robe and cross as a sign of devotion, our women wear modest dress as a symbol of faith and self-respect. But they are oppressed, Olivia snapped. They can't lead prayers. They can't testify equally. He nodded gently. There are differences in roles, not because of inferiority, but because of different responsibilities. In areas where women have greater expertise, they are the sole witnesses, like childbirth. Equality doesn't always mean identical roles. Olivia slammed her hand on the pulpit. You speak like a poet, she said, but Islam is full of rules. How to eat, sleep, dress, even use the bathroom. Where is the freedom in that? Imam Yusuf smiled for the first time. Rules are not a prison. They are a safety net. Just as a mother tells her child not to touch fire, God gives us boundaries, not to chain us, but to protect us. A few people in the audience lowered their eyes and thought. Olivia wasn't done. And the afterlife? Rivers of milk? Pearls and silk? It sounds like a fantasy. Imam Yusuf answered. Maybe. But it is described that way because our minds need images to grasp what lies beyond. Heaven is not about material things. It's about peace, peace with the one who made us. The church was silent now, not because they agreed, but because they were listening. And in that moment, as morning light spilled across the altar, Sister Olivia realized this debate had only just begun, not on a stage of conflict, but in a room where centuries of misunderstanding were finally being brought into the light. The heavy silence that hung over the church of San Marco wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was curious. The congregation leaned in, not to witness a battle, but a conversation they had never expected to hear inside their sacred walls. Sister Olivia, known for her fiery sermons, now stood in front of an old man whose quiet strength was melting walls built by years of prejudice. But Olivia wasn't ready to surrender. She folded her arms tightly and stared into the eyes of Imam Yusuf Rahman. If your religion is so peaceful, why is the world afraid of it? She asked with a biting tone. Why is Islam so often associated with terrorism, violence, and chaos? Why do so many fear your people and your faith? Imam Yusuf paused. He didn't rush. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts with care, not to defend, but to illuminate. Because most people don't know Islam, he said softly. They know headlines. They know fear. They know what media tells them. They are not afraid of Islam itself, they are afraid of a shadow. A shadow painted by years of misinformation. His voice lowered as he continued. Just like people once feared those with different skin, different accents, different languages, not because they were evil, but because they were unknown. Several in the congregation nodded silently. Olivia's brows furrowed. But it's not just the media. The Prophet Muhammad, why should we believe in him? He was not educated, not part of the Jewish lineage, and he didn't even meet Jesus. Why should I trust someone like that? Imam Yusuf didn't take offense. He gently clasped his hands and said, That's exactly why you should ask. The Prophet Muhammad was unlettered, yet the words he brought continued to challenge the world's greatest minds. A man with no formal education, no power, no wealth, and yet, Within 23 years, he transformed a tribal, violent society into one of compassion, law, and justice. He took a step forward. Why would a man lie when he gained no benefit? When he suffered, bled, and starved for the message he carried? Even his enemies called him the trustworthy. He stood against the corrupt, lifted the oppressed, freed slaves, and honored orphans. Olivia remained quiet, trying to find another thread to pull. He married many women, she said, as if throwing her last card. Even young ones. Isn't that evidence of lust, not leadership? Imam Yusuf did not flinch. Most of his marriages were not for desire, but for protection. Widows, elderly women, daughters of fallen companions. Only one of his marriages was rooted in personal love, and that was his first. He stayed loyal to her for 25 years. After she passed, his remaining marriages were part of his mission. A hush spread across the church. The clergymen watching from behind the altar shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they expected. Not defiance, not arrogance, but clear, composed explanations. Olivia's voice grew quieter. What about jihad? That word itself feels terrifying. Isn't jihad about killing? War? Conquering? Imam Yusuf's eyes became serious, but his voice remained calm. Jihad means struggle. It can be internal, to overcome anger, pride, and selfishness. It can also mean defending your family, your home, your beliefs. But it was never meant to terrorize. True jihad is the effort to do what is right, even when it's hard. He turned to the audience now. If jihad were about bloodshed, then why would our scriptures teach us to show mercy even to enemies? To protect churches, synagogues, and other places of worship? To treat prisoners of war with dignity? Olivia quickly interjected. But your scriptures do say, kill them wherever you find them. That doesn't sound peaceful to me. Imam Yusuf nodded, almost expecting the question. Yes, that verse exists. But context matters. It was revealed during a time of war, when Muslims were being persecuted, driven from their homes, tortured, and killed. That part of the verse is followed by limits. It says, do not fight unless you are attacked. Do not go beyond what is just. Even in war there are rules. For the first time, Sister Olivia hesitated. Her voice faltered. If all that is true, she said slowly, why do I still feel nothing when I hear about Islam? Why, instead of peace, do I feel coldness, anger, and doubt? Imam Yusuf stepped closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to impress. Because you never met Islam. You met its enemies. You met stories of violence, not prayers of peace. You saw broken images, not the whole picture. Faith cannot be known by watching fire. You have to feel its warmth yourself. There was a visible tremble in Olivia's shoulders. Her hands were clenched, not in fury now, but in inner confusion. And yet, she whispered, every time I curse Islam, I feel emptier. Imam Yusuf looked at her with the tenderness of a father comforting a struggling child. Because your soul is searching for truth. And sometimes truth stings before it soothes. You are not fighting Islam. You are fighting the ghost of lies you inherited. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. She looked away, trying to contain the storm brewing in her chest. The room was no longer just a church. It had become a sanctuary for something deeper, the battle between belief and inherited fear. She wiped her eyes and asked, barely above a whisper, why didn't you ever get angry at my words? My insults? My accusations? Imam Yusuf smiled gently. Because I didn't come to win a debate. I came so truth would not remain silent. So that if even one heart wanted light, it would not be denied by darkness. And in that moment, Olivia didn't speak. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. The audience remained still. No one clapped. No one whispered. Even the senior priest at the altar lowered his head, touched by the calm and clarity of a man they had never met, but who now felt like a bearer of something more ancient than dogma, truth without hatred. Suddenly, Olivia raised her head again. Her voice cracked, but she forced it out. If Islam is so true, then why does it treat women like shadows? Why must they cover? Why can't they lead? Why are their words worth only half? Imam Yusuf inhaled deeply and looked at her, not with anger, but with understanding. He knew this was not just a question of logic, but of pain, the pain of misunderstanding. I'll answer, he said softly, but only if your heart is truly ready to listen. The sunlight had shifted, painting longer shadows on the floor of the church, but no one had moved. It was as if time had slowed. The air inside was heavier now, yet calmer, thick with reflection, not argument. Sister Olivia stood, her hands gripping the edge of the pulpit, her expression torn between defiance and confusion. I'm listening, she said finally. Her voice wasn't as sharp anymore. It held something new, maybe exhaustion, or maybe sincerity. Imam Yusuf Rahman nodded. You asked why women in Islam are told to cover. Why they are not allowed to lead prayers. Why their testimony in some cases is considered half of a man's. Let me answer each one with the respect your question deserves. The congregation remained still. Even those who earlier appeared skeptical now leaned forward, their eyes locked on him. He began. Modesty in Islam is not a punishment. It is a protection. Women are not asked to cover because they are shameful, but because they are valuable. Our societies have taught us to measure a woman by how much of her body she reveals. Islam teaches us to value her for her mind, her character, her heart. He paused and glanced gently at Olivia. It's not about hiding. It's about being seen for who you really are, not just what you look like. A middle-aged woman in the front pew blinked away tears. She clutched her purse tightly, perhaps thinking back to years of being judged by her appearance. But it limits their freedom, Olivia replied. Women should be free to dress how they want, speak as they wish, and walk where they please. Freedom without responsibility is chaos, Imam Yusuf replied. If I walk into your home and say, I'm free to do what I want, would you call that respect or arrogance? He let that question linger. Islam frames freedom within boundaries. Just like every civilized society. Traffic laws don't take away our freedom, they keep us safe. The same is true with dress and behavior, especially in a world that constantly objectifies women. The veil is not a prison. It is a shield. Olivia shook her head slowly, but her resistance was clearly fading. And the testimony of women? She asked. That law, Imam Yusuf answered, was in the context of financial transactions, a field where, historically, women had less involvement. The rule was set not because women were less intelligent, but because shared responsibility would prevent forgetfulness. In other matters, especially in childbirth or cases involving women, their testimony is not only equal, but sometimes preferred. He walked forward slightly and continued. One of the greatest narrators of prophetic tradition was a woman, a scholar, a jurist, a teacher of men. She preserved over 2,000 sayings and was consulted on matters of law. Her name was Aisha. Was she oppressed? Or was she empowered in a way the world rarely acknowledges? The silence in the church deepened. Even Olivia did not respond immediately. But she wasn't finished. Then why can't women lead prayers? Why is the Imam always a man? Imam Yusuf's voice was gentle. Leading prayer is not a position of power. It is a role based on structure, not superiority. It involves guiding a congregation in a ritual that has been structured for balance and unity. But women lead in many other ways. They educate, they inspire, they counsel. And history is filled with women scholars, warriors, and spiritual leaders. He looked around the room. Islam doesn't limit women. It protects their strengths and honors their role. The problem isn't the religion. It's how people have misunderstood it, or misused it. There were soft murmurs now, not of disagreement, but of contemplation. A few people looked toward Olivia, waiting to see what she would say next. Her jaw clenched slightly. "You've answered every question I've thrown at you," she said, calmly, without anger, without pride. "But I have one more." Imam Yusuf nodded. She stepped out from behind the pulpit. Her voice dropped low. "How can a religion that calls itself peaceful allow verses that command violence? Doesn't your book say, 'Kill them wherever you find them'? That doesn't sound like protection. That sounds like a holy war." Imam Yusuf looked into her eyes, not flinching. "Yes, that verse exists," he said. "But it is one line from a long passage about a real war, a historical moment. It was a call to resist oppression, not to hunt innocent people. It was revealed when believers were being expelled from their homes, tortured, and forbidden from worshipping. The same passage continues with limits: do not transgress. Do not fight unless you are attacked. That verse is not a command for eternal war. It is a context for a specific struggle." He turned to the congregation. "If we take verses out of context, every scripture becomes dangerous. Every faith has verses about war, punishment, fire, but the question is, do we read them with understanding, or use them for hate?" Olivia exhaled through her nose. Her composure was cracking, but her heart was stirring in unfamiliar ways. "You speak about mercy," she said. "But your religion has graphic descriptions of hell, of fire, of smoke and punishment. It sounds terrifying." Imam Yusuf nodded. "It is. Because consequences are real. But those verses are not the whole message. They are warnings, like signs on a road saying, 'Sharp turn ahead.' And even after those warnings, the message is still full of mercy." He looked back at her. "There are also verses that say no one should despair. That forgiveness is open to all. That God is more loving than the mistakes we make. Even to those who insult him, if they return, they are embraced." The church was still. Olivia bit her lip. She looked down at the floor, then back up. "If your God is so loving," she whispered, "why does he allow so much suffering in the world? Starving children, wars, earthquakes, cruelty. Where is the mercy in that?" Imam Yusuf's voice softened again. "That is the hardest question of all. But the answer is not hidden." He walked a few steps toward the altar. "This world is not paradise. It is a test. A journey. Just like gold is purified through fire, we are refined through struggle. Pain is not always punishment. Sometimes it wakes us up. Sometimes it brings us closer to compassion. And sometimes it's the only way a soul returns to its Creator." The tears in Olivia's eyes returned, but this time, not from anger. She was listening, truly listening, not just with her ears, but with something deeper. She sat down slowly on the edge of the altar bench. Her shoulders sagged. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If someone like me, who mocked, insulted, and attacked your beliefs, wanted to learn the truth, would I have to give up who I am? My name? My identity? My past?" Imam Yusuf looked at her with eyes that held decades of wisdom and pain. "No," he said. "You would not lose yourself. You would lose your confusion, your hatred, your doubt. The truth doesn't destroy, it heals. It fills the empty spaces. And it lets you be the best version of who you already are." There was a long silence. A silence filled not with fear, but with awakening. And in that silence, Olivia whispered the question no one thought she would ever ask. The question floated into the silence like a prayer no one had expected. "What would it take to understand what you believe?" Sister Olivia's voice was no longer sharp or rhetorical. It was fragile, almost childlike, as though she had peeled back every layer of armor and finally stood exposed, asking not as a defender of her religion, but as a soul aching for clarity. Imam Yusuf Rahman stood quietly, his hands folded before him, the light from the stained glass casting soft patterns over his robe. "It takes sincerity," he said gently. "Not perfection. Not rituals. Not a change of name or appearance. Just a heart willing to search, not with arrogance, but with honesty." The church, once filled with tension, now held an entirely different weight, the weight of something sacred happening in real time. Congregants looked at each other, their gazes uncertain, but not hostile. Something was shifting. "But I've been taught to hate Islam since I was a child," Olivia admitted quietly, staring at the stone floor. "I've preached against it, warned people, told them it was false. I thought I was doing God's work." Imam Yusuf stepped closer, not imposing, but present. "Many of us are raised with walls we didn't build. And sometimes we spend our lives defending those walls without ever questioning what lies behind them." Her eyes lifted, moist and red. "Why didn't you come here to fight me? Why didn't you shout? I was so cruel to you." Imam Yusuf's answer came without pause. "Because truth doesn't need to shout. And it doesn't need to humiliate. It needs to reach hearts. That's why I'm here, not to win against you, but to offer a window out of the prison of misunderstanding." For the first time, Olivia turned away from the congregation. She seemed unsure of her role, her identity, her purpose. She was no longer the bold preacher, but a seeker drowning in the noise of what she once believed was right. The senior priest, who had watched the entire conversation in stunned silence, finally stepped forward. He looked at Imam Yusuf with eyes that weren't defensive, but deeply thoughtful. "I must admit," he said, voice slightly cracked with emotion, "I never imagined I'd see someone stand on this floor and speak of another faith with such calm and compassion, and not provoke hostility." Imam Yusuf bowed slightly. "Compassion doesn't cancel conviction. We can speak firmly, but with mercy. I never came to attack the church. I came because truth must respond when misrepresented." The priest nodded slowly and turned toward Olivia. "What do you feel right now?" Olivia clutched the pulpit with trembling hands. "I feel like I've been shouting for years, and suddenly, someone whispered and everything changed. I don't even know who I am anymore." Imam Yusuf spoke softly. "You are someone on the edge of truth. That is not something to fear, that is something to treasure." She turned to him again. "But I still have doubts. I still don't understand everything. Doesn't that disqualify me?" He shook his head. "Doubt is not disobedience. It's part of the journey. Real faith is not built in a day. It's built in the moments you allow yourself to question without shame and to listen without defense." Suddenly, Olivia asked, "Then tell me, what did your prophet recite when he bowed down in worship?" Imam Yusuf smiled. "A simple phrase. But it carries the weight of devotion. He said, 'Glory be to my Lord, the Most High.'" Olivia closed her eyes. She repeated the sentence in a soft voice, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Her lips trembled as she whispered it again. A hush swept across the church. For the first time in that sacred place, a woman known for attacking Islam had just spoken words of reverence that connected her to the very thing she once feared. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks now. The congregation sat quietly, many of them visibly moved. Even those who had walked in with suspicion were now witnessing something undeniably profound. "I'm not ready to convert," Olivia said, her voice breaking. "But for the first time in my life, I feel like I've tasted a drop of peace, and it came from the very thing I was taught to fear." Imam Yusuf nodded, his expression calm but emotional. "You don't need to rush. Truth is patient. It waits. It knocks gently. When your heart is ready, you won't need to force anything. It will unfold naturally." The priest placed a hand on her shoulder. "We have all believed in things we never questioned. Today you questioned. And that is not betrayal, that is courage." As the crowd sat in awe, someone from the back pew rose slowly. An older woman with silver hair and tired eyes. I always thought Islam was a threat, she said, almost ashamed. But I never listened. I never heard it from someone who lives it. She looked at Imam Yusuf. Thank you? He nodded humbly. Truth has no owner. It belongs to those who seek it. Olivia stepped down from the pulpit, her legs shaky, but her steps deliberate. She approached Imam Yusuf and stood before him, the woman who once screamed from a platform, now quiet as a student before her teacher. I don't know what happens next, she whispered, but I want to keep learning. I want to understand more. I don't want to be afraid anymore. Imam Yusuf extended a hand. Not to shake, but as a symbol, an invitation to a journey that was only beginning. Then walk, he said. Not toward me. Toward truth. And let it guide you at its own pace. She nodded. And just like that, something shifted in the church. It no longer felt like a battlefield of ideas. It had become a space for hearts, a meeting place between misunderstanding and illumination. That evening, the church was different. There was no applause, no loud debates, no announcements, only silence. A holy kind of silence. One woman, once consumed by anger, had taken her first steps toward clarity. One congregation, once united by a shared narrative, now sat in individual reflection. And one stranger, with nothing but his words, had shown them all that truth does not enter by force, it enters quietly, like light through a stained glass window. The night after the debate at the Church of San Marco was unlike any other. The congregation, once firm in their preconceived beliefs, had gone home in silence, not in anger or disbelief, but in deep thought. For some, it was the first time in years they'd looked at their Bible, not for comfort, but for confirmation. And for others, the echoes of Imam Yusuf Rahman's words wouldn't leave their hearts. But for Sister Olivia, the night was long and restless. She sat at her bedroom window, looking up at the stars with tear-stained eyes. The silence in her heart was both unsettling and calming, like a storm had passed, but its memory remained. She whispered to herself, "Why did I feel peace when I repeated those words? Why do I feel like something broke, but in a good way?" The days passed, and Olivia didn't preach. She didn't argue. She didn't speak of her confusion to the congregation. But within her heart, questions bloomed like wildflowers in abandoned soil. A week later, she did something no one expected. She visited Imam Yusuf Rahman. He welcomed her not in a grand mosque or a marble hall, but in a small, simple prayer room, clean, quiet, humble. There were no paintings, no gold-trimmed books, no rituals she recognized. Just stillness. And him, sitting calmly on a rug, waiting. "Thank you for seeing me," she said softly. "You came," Imam Yusuf replied with a gentle smile. "That's the part that matters. I'm still confused," she admitted. "But it's like a curtain has been pulled back, and I can't unsee what I saw." He nodded. "Clarity doesn't always come all at once. Sometimes it's like dawn, first darkness, then faint light, then full sunrise." She looked down at her hands. "People ask me what happened. Why I've gone silent. I don't know what to say. I'm not Muslim. But I don't know how to defend what I used to believe anymore." Imam Yusuf poured her a cup of tea and passed it to her without a word. "I came today," she continued, "with one last set of questions. Not to argue. But because I need answers, not for the church. For myself." Imam Yusuf nodded again. "Ask." She inhaled deeply. "If your religion is truly about peace, then why do we see so much suffering among your people? Why are Muslims persecuted in so many parts of the world, in Palestine, in parts of Asia, Africa, even in Western societies? Why doesn't your God help them? Why doesn't he rescue the innocent?" Imam Yusuf's expression changed, not from anger, but from pain. The question clearly hurt, because it was deeply personal. He looked her in the eye. "Because heaven is not cheap," She blinked. What do you mean? Our scripture teaches that belief is not enough. It must be tested. Those who say, we believe, are not left without trials. And those trials, whether through oppression, loss, or pain, refine the soul. He leaned forward, his voice a little heavier now. When a child is starving in Gaza, when a woman is being denied her right to pray, when a man is jailed for his faith, those are not signs of divine cruelty. They are the echoes of a broken world where evil still has room to act. But isn't that unfair? Olivia asked, her voice trembling. Why does God allow such a thing? Because free will exists. Because this world is not paradise. It is a bridge. A place of testing, where the oppressed will rise again in the next life, and the oppressors will answer. He paused and added, and it is precisely in suffering that many come closer to their Creator. Pain softens hearts that comfort could never reach. Olivia stared at the steam rising from her tea. I was taught that suffering is punishment, she whispered. Imam Yusuf shook his head. No. Sometimes, suffering is the wake-up call. Sometimes, it's the pathway to higher purpose. We don't worship suffering, but we understand its role. Even prophets suffered. Even saints bled. Would we be exempt? The room was still. The wind rustled gently outside the open window, as if nature itself was eavesdropping. Olivia slowly set her tea down. Do I have to lose everything to accept your faith? She asked. My name, my family, my history? No, he said firmly. You only lose what weighs you down. Hate. Confusion. The burden of contradiction. What remains is who you truly are. She looked at him again. Then why do people fear conversion so much? Because they think it means becoming someone else. But it doesn't. It means becoming who you were always meant to be. There was silence again. But it wasn't heavy. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast, a sea, a mountain, a choice. Imam Yusuf finally spoke again. You asked many questions the day we met. Some were sharp. Some were painful. But all of them were real. And the truth is, we're all searching, you, me, the people who listened. And when truth appears, the only question is, will we have the humility to follow it? Olivia's eyes were red again. She stood up, walked toward the prayer space, and looked around. No statues. No paintings. Just direction. He nodded. Because prayer is not about decoration. It's about intention. She turned to him, her voice barely audible. Can I try to pray? Imam Yusuf stepped back gently. You can try. You don't have to be perfect. She took off her shoes. She stood on the mat. She didn't know what to say or how to stand. But she closed her eyes. And for the first time in her life, she didn't speak to God as a priestess, or as a preacher, or as someone with answers. She spoke as someone searching. Someone surrendering. And it was enough. When she finished, she turned back to him. Her cheeks were wet. Her lips trembled. I still don't know everything, she said. You don't need to, he replied. Truth isn't a test you pass. It's a path you walk. There were no witnesses. No cameras. No grand announcements. But something monumental had occurred. Not a conversion. Not yet. But a crack in the wall of years of doubt and distance. And through that crack, a single beam of peace. Weeks had passed since the unforgettable day inside the church of San Marco. Sister Olivia had withdrawn from public preaching, and the congregation had stopped asking why. They had seen something in her eyes that didn't need explanation, a quiet storm, a war of the soul, an awakening too deep for words. In the privacy of her small room, Olivia spent most of her nights sitting by the window, searching the sky. Her Bible lay beside her. So did a borrowed copy of the translated Quran. She had started reading it, not with the goal of proving it wrong, but with the desire to finally understand what it was saying. There were nights she cried. Nights she smiled. Nights she read the same page over and over, trying to absorb a truth she had once rejected with such fire. And then came the night when she couldn't ignore it anymore. She walked once again to the small mosque where Imam Yusuf Rahman prayed. It was quiet, humble, still. He was there, as always, seated peacefully in the front. When he saw her, he didn't react with surprise, only calm, patient welcome. "I've read everything," she said, her voice steady. "I've listened. I've fought. And I've searched." Imam Yusuf simply waited. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I always believed that I was on the side of truth. But the more I questioned, the more I realized that truth is not something you inherit. It's something you discover. I've lived a life defending what I was taught, not what I understood." Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. "I want to say the words. Not because anyone expects it, but because I believe it now. In my heart. In my soul." Imam Yusuf stood and came forward. His eyes filled with tears. "You understand what it means?" "I do," she whispered. "That there is only one God. That He alone deserves worship. That Muhammad was His messenger. And that truth is peace." Imam Yusuf nodded gently. "Then say it," he said, "and let your soul rest." And there, in that quiet room, without any audience, without any cameras, without any applause, Sister Olivia recited the testimony of faith. Her voice was shaking. Her hands were trembling. But her heart, for the first time in her life, felt still. When she finished, she collapsed to her knees. Tears streamed down her face. Imam Yusuf didn't speak. He let her cry, not from regret, but from release. It was as if years of anger, pride, and confusion had fallen away like dust from a window finally opened. After a long silence, she looked up at him. "Is this what peace feels like?" He smiled. "This is only the beginning." The news spread slowly but reverently. Those who had witnessed the church debate were the first to hear. Some were shocked. Others wept. A few whispered in corners, unsure how to react. But one thing was undeniable: a transformation had occurred that no one could deny. The next Sunday, the church of San Marco was unusually full. People came not for the sermon, but out of curiosity. Olivia was no longer standing at the pulpit. But she entered the church one last time, not as a preacher, but as a guest. She walked to the front pew and turned to the people who had once applauded her anger and mimicked her words. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't quote scripture. She simply said, "I spent years teaching you to fear what I never understood. I was wrong. And I am no longer afraid." There was a pause. A long one. Then she walked out of the church with her head high and her heart quiet. Her journey didn't end that day. In many ways, it had just begun. She began learning to pray, step by step. She learned to stand in silence, to bow in humility, to reflect instead of react. Her clothes changed, not because someone told her to, but because her understanding of dignity evolved. She didn't rush to preach. Instead, she listened. She visited shelters. She fed the poor. She started writing, not sermons, but reflections on truth, transformation, and spiritual courage. And as for the Church of San Marco, something strange and beautiful began to happen. Visitors came not just for worship, but for dialogue. Bible studies now included comparative discussions. People began reading, exploring, questioning, not to argue, but to learn. And Imam Yusuf Rahman, once a stranger, became a respected friend, not because he converted anyone, but because he proved that love, reason, and truth do not need to shout. They only need to be lived. In her final journal entry before leaving for a quiet retreat, Olivia wrote, "I did not convert to escape anything. I embraced the truth that had been chasing me for years. Truth is not a sword. It is a mirror. And when I finally looked in it, I didn't see a stranger. I saw who I was always meant to be. She signed it. Olivia, now at peace.